Start. I do. My dongle died. So I'm unable to do what I normally do, so I'm going to do something different. It's a nice group. It's a nice group, and since I'm paid by the head, tonight's a flourishing night. So raise your hands if the following offends you. There was no virgin birth of Jesus. Jesus was not born in Bethlehem. There was no manger, shepherds, or animals. There were no wise men, angels, or even a star or manger. Jesus isn't related to King David. Anybody have a problem with that? Okay. All right. Let's do it. There. So stand if you're very offended. Anybody need to stand? Because you're very offended, all right? Well, you can't blame me for this. Welcome to the gospel according to Mark. Okay? None of those things are in Mark. None of them. Remember last week we talked about all the things that are in the Gospels, traditional language, and all of these things we assume are in all of them. Well, they're not. They're really not. The Gospel of Mark, which we shall refer to as the Markan Gospel, there's a reason for that, is not the second written Gospel. It's not in our Bibles, right? It's the second. Although it does appear after the Matthean Gospel in all of our Bibles. But it is, in fact, historically, it's the first Gospel written. All right? And the editors of the canon, believe it or not, our Bibles had editors who made decisions about the order of things, what was in, what was out. And guess what? Guess what in the prophets it determines the order of that? Length. Just length. The longest to the shortest. The editors placed the Matthean Gospel first, with the Markan Gospel separating the Matthean and the Lucan Gospels. And there's a reason for that. And guess what? We'll find that out next week. It's a cliffhanger to keep you coming. So biblical historians and academics place the writing of the Markan Gospel between 70 and 72 CE, the Common Era. We don't use AD anymore, okay? Between 70 and 72, and there's a big reason for that. In fact, there's a lot of reasons for that. A timeline for which I am famous is needed. People just love my timelines. I'm complimented on them all the time. Let's assemble some events and dates. The blue line. The Markan Gospel covers 3 years. 3 years. 3 años. Okay? And it is 27. This is the idea of the beginning of his ministry. And Mark begins with the beginning of his ministry. That's why a lot of those things aren't in Mark. Okay? And it ends, of course, in the execution of Jesus in Jerusalem. And that's 3 years. Tiny little timeline, right? And so from 30, execution, all the way to 70, which is the siege of Jerusalem by the Roman army, okay? And 72 is roughly right in there is where the Markan Gospel is written. So an absolutely enormous event. You understand that if Jerusalem falls, if the temple is torn to the ground, Judaism, as they knew it, is no more. And it gets worse because they shipped the Jews out into what became called the diaspora of the Mediterranean basin. And along with the Jews, they shipped out the Christians because they were still embedded in the synagogue, in the temple. But without the temple, you don't have Judaism as we've known it. And it wasn't the first time this had happened to them. So 40 to 42 years after the execution, 2 generations, the writing of the Gospel of Mark. Mark 13, 1 and 2. Leaving the temple, Jesus said, "Do you see these great buildings? Big, beautiful buildings. Not one stone will be left upon another, for all will be torn down." A little overstatement. They didn't tear everything down. The Romans really tried on the Temple Mount. They got off the first layer of the surrounding wall, and it's all lying down below the walls. It's still there. It's massive. But it took a lot of men to just move one stone because they were so huge. And they had bigger and better things to do, and the damage was already done. In 68 CE, General Titus, the son of the Roman Emperor Vespasian, laid siege to Jerusalem. We hear about Masada in this time period as well. It is the same time.
What does CE stand for?
Common Era. We don't use Anno Domino anymore. AD. Thing of the past. Gone. Shredded. No more.
Okay, obsolete.
Kaput.
Like the temple. Like the temple.
Just like the temple. By gum. Okay? And so this was huge. And it's easy to prophesy after the event has already happened. Okay, if you're going to write Mark 40 years after the event of his execution, you can also write it after this horrific event has happened in Jerusalem and the destruction of the temple and the city. The Markan Gospel is quite unique. It is very unique in many ways. It begins with Jesus' baptism by John the Baptist. He's fully grown, right? He's a grown man. We have nothing about anything before that. So what's missing? Well, lots. There's no angelic birth announcement of Jesus, right? The Annunciation. But which angel spoke to who, right? Because they don't agree on that, the two Gospels that include this. Mary isn't listed as a virgin at his conception. She's hardly referred to at all. Hardly referred to at all. Bethlehem plays no role in his birth. Not at all. He's from Nazareth. Yeshua Nazareta. There is no genealogy of Jesus, begat, to connect him to persons in the past. And Jesus isn't related to David at all. That's a lot missing, isn't it? There's no mention of Joseph. Joseph is an invention of later gospel writers. Did you know that? There's no Joseph in Mark. Mark didn't need Joseph. And for good reason. Mark 6, 2-3. Okay? When the Sabbath came, Jesus began to teach in the synagogue, and the many listeners were astonished, saying, "Where did this man learn these things? What is this wisdom that he has been given to him, and such miracles as these performed by his hands?" They're amazed. They're amazed at this, right? And so far, so good. And then we get into a problem. It gets sticky. Is this not the carpenter, the son of Mary? Is this not the carpenter, son of Mary? And brother of James, Joseph, Judas, and Simon? He's got 4 brothers. And they don't bother naming his sisters, but he's got sisters too. This is a whole passel of people. And they took offense at him. Why? Because it's where he was from, right? All this. But that is in Mark. That's in Mark. No father is mentioned, and this is a big problem. Big problem. Misogyny is an historical reality. I think we'd all agree with that. A child is identified via the father. My friend Kristin Sigmundsson, and if there was a Kristina Sigmundsdottir, who's the father? Sigmund, right? They still do that today. Legitimacy is established via the father. Paternal names confer legitimacy, right? At least this has been historically dominant. Would you not agree? Thompson, Johnson, Paulson, Harrison, Sampson. We're used to all of those, and the list goes on and on and on. Each are typical to all of us. But how about these? Are they familiar in the slightest? Rachelson, Juliuson, Sanderson, Sandy, I put that up for you. Sanderson and Barbarason. I mean, do we know these names? Not at all. Not at all. None of these are typical to us. We don't do that. Do they indicate illegitimacy if we did? It's hard to say because it's a nothing. Muhammad bin Salman, David ben Gurion, right, are typical in Saudi Arabia and in Israel. Yeshua ben Miriam. Yeshua ben Miriam. This name would not be typical in Israel. Jesus, son of Mary. In Hebrew, Yeshua ben Miriam. It wouldn't. Is this not Yeshua, son of Miriam? Boy, that is loaded. It indicates illegitimacy, clear and simple. And later gospel writers are going to change it. They're going to change it. But this is in our Markan gospel. Mark kind of tells it like it is in his own way. He's the first. It is the first written gospel. Imagine that. All kinds of Jesus sayings are floating around and all kinds of stories. It goes from oral to written with this gospel. It begins in Galilee. The majority of Jesus' activities are in the north, way in the north. This isn't near Jerusalem. It's way in the north. In fact, it's outside of the governorship of Pontius Pilate. He's not in charge up there. You know that? He's not in charge. Jesus gets into trouble when he comes out of the Galilee and comes down into Jerusalem. After his baptism, Jesus goes to the wilderness, right? We all know that story. We all know that story. But in Mark, it's tiny. There's no temptations on the standing on the temple and throw yourselves down and angels will swoop in and it won't let you hit your heel against a stone. These are inventions of later gospel writers. But Mark is the first. And it's so tiny compared. There he's tempted greatly by the devil, but it doesn't say for very long or specifics. He withstands temptation and returns home. Very quick. Tiny paragraph, little. He sets about assembling his chosen disciples. Who are the gospel authors? Who are they? Who wrote the gospels? Well, we have these names, right? We have these names. But what group are they from? We've heard it all our lives. What is the special group that wrote the Gospels? Disciples. The disciples of Jesus, right? The disciples of Jesus. And so they have to have, they've got a pedigree, don't they? Before we name them, what qualifies them, right? They should have some kind of pedigree. They can't be just anybody. Shouldn't they have direct experience with what they're writing about? Wouldn't you think? I mean, that's what I've heard all my life, is that the Gospels were written by their firsthand eyewitness accounts. There should be reasons to trust what they write. It should be something. And what group meets this criteria? Well, Mark 3:13 through 19. Then Jesus called to himself the 12, whom he had chosen, Simon, whom he named Peter. So now we're switching names already. And Simon, who he named Peter, is referred to as Cephas by Paul. So he's got three names, all right? James and his brother John, Andrew, Philip, Bartholomew, Matthew, Thomas, James, son of Alphaeus, Thaddeus, Simon the Patriot, and Judas Iscariot, who betrayed Jesus. Now, remember that Alphaeus has a son, okay? Because in Mark, James is son of Alphaeus. So next week, pay attention. I'll remind you. I'll remind you. And this is our list given to us by Mark. Here's our list of the 12. Okay, let's pay a little attention to it. John and Matthew are on the list. There's no Mark, there's no Luke, there's no Paul. And yet, How did they get on the list? Does anybody know who Mark and Luke were? Why do we know them? Yes, sir.
Was Mark like a reporter? He did research with the apostles and people from that era?
Mark was a follower and a companion to Paul, and so was Luke.
Wasn't Luke also a doctor? Sometime?
How many books have been written about Luke the doctor? It's all based on traditional language. So Mark and Luke were followers of Paul, and Paul never met Jesus and never heard Jesus, never walked with Jesus, and came way after Jesus. And so we now have gospel writers who aren't on this list, not even close to on this list. And so it gets problematic, because I was always told that the Gospels were eyewitness accounts by disciples of Jesus. And they're not on this list. After having assembled his disciples, Jesus sets about teaching using parables. We agree on that. This was a way to speak. Okay? And there's a lot of them. And this is a group, I think there's a total of 9 that I've got here. And these are all things we know. We know these. And they appear for the first time in the Gospel of Mark, our earliest Gospel. Jesus also begins performing miracles according to the Gospel of Mark. And there's lots of these in here. And, Peter's mother-in-law gets in there, Everybody's mother-in-law gets in there somehow. It's like TV shows. All right? So, and these, again, this is all common material. We know this material. And this appears for the first time written in the Gospel of Mark. Jesus constantly urges those whom he's healed to refrain from speaking to others about their healing, and do any of them follow his orders. Nary one.
Well, how could you not, though? I mean, a paralyzed man is walking. Well, you don't have to say anything.
You don't have to say anything, but boy, did they. It's fascinating. It's fascinating. It is fascinating. So it's interesting, and they never take his instructions at all. The Markan author continues. The 12 are given authority to perform miracles independent of Jesus. That's big stuff, right? They are instructed to disregard skepticism from unwelcoming communities and move on and shake the dust from your sandals. That's pretty profound, Get out of there. The keepers of the law, the Pharisees, begin challenging Jesus on nearly every turn, right? Right out of the chute, they're after him. Mark 7, 5 through 8. Why do your disciples not observe the tradition of the elders, but eat their bread with unwashed hands? They don't wash their hands. And the Pharisees have a problem with it. But it's in the law. Remember, we have 613 mitzvot, laws, that we've been given. And everybody agrees that it's pretty impossible to follow them, all of them. But this is something you have to do. You have to do this. Jesus shocks them by offering new ways of approaching the laws, new ways of thinking. He says, I don't agree. We're out in a field. We're hungry. How are we supposed to eat? Is it better to be hungry and have dirty hands, or to eat hungry and have clean hands, or eat and have dirty hands? Whatever. He's saying, this is nonsense. This doesn't make sense. We can't do this all the time. Jesus said, as it is written, this people honors me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me. In vain do they worship me, teaching the doctrines of men. What is he referring to as the doctrines of men? The law. They had a ton of them. And Jesus is saying to the Pharisees how to win friends and influence people. Jesus steadily dismantles even the dietary laws by declaring all things of God as being clean. But it's not. What about the things that aren't kosher? Jesus said, there's nothing outside a person which can defile him. Only things which come from him can defile. So what's he saying about all the dietary laws? He's attacking everything. Everything. This departure from Pharisaic Judaism sets Jesus apart as being a heretic. Big time. This charge will develop and eventually be used against him by the Sanhedrin and the high priest in Jerusalem. It just keeps compounding. Jesus is steadily redefining Judaism and himself. He's a big troublemaker.
What does heretic?
Hmm?
What does heretic mean?
A heretic? Okay, let's take the word heresy. Heresy is the opposite of orthodoxy. Orthodoxy is right thinking. Heresy is wrong thinking. A heretic doesn't think right. They're outside of how we are supposed to think. That's what heresy and orthodoxy mean. Right thinking and wrong thinking. Jesus is exhibiting serious wrong thinking to the powers that be. Okay? This is important. Jesus asked Peter who Peter thinks he is. Now we're edging into a whole nother realm. Mark 8. Peter answered, "You're the Mashiach," the Messiah we use. But in Hebrew it's Mashiach. You're the Mashiach. I mean, we think we own this word in Christianity. But the Mashiach, the Messiah, has been a part of Judaism long before. What is a Mashiach? What is the Messiah in Judaism? Anointed one, exactly. The anointed one. And what does that one do? They lead. They lead and they drive out that which is counter to Judaism out of the area where the Jews live. In other words, a great general. Mashiach. We think of it as the crucified Savior as being what Messiah means. But its root does not include that. The Mashiach is not vanquished. And so this word here is very important. You are the Mashiach, Messiah. And Jesus warned him to tell no one about this. All right? So in Hebrew, it does mean anointed one, and it was translated into Greek as Christos. But it is a particularly Jewish word, Mashiach. Jesus declares his fate to his disciples, outright, up front. All right? These are for some tough words. The Son of Man must suffer and be rejected by the... Whoa, baby. It's going to happen again. It happens 3 times. We'll read this one. They're about identical. So this is the second one in it. I've got some technical issues tonight. Just bear with me. The Son of Man is to be handed over to men meaning non-Jews, Gentiles. They will kill him, and when he has been killed, he will rise in 3 days. What's the most shocking thing about that statement to you? Rise again in 3 days. His disciples never notice that one. They argue about the first one. Oh, no, that can't ever have you. You can't allow that to happen. And they never comment about that third one. And here's the final one. The final one, if I get this right. Come on. In Jerusalem, now he's being specific. The Son of Man will be handed over to the chief priests, who will condemn him and will hand him over to the Gentiles. Who are the Gentiles? The Romans. They will mock him, spit on him, flog him, and kill him. 3 days later, he will rise from the dead. Could he be more specific? He has, in case any of them hadn't figured this out, he's made his point to his disciples. And suddenly, bingo, they're in Jerusalem. They're there. 3 years have passed, all kinds of stuff way up north, and now they're there, and it's Passover week. This is big time. This is a big Passover, and people are coming in. Jews are coming into the city from all around. It's filling up with people. And guess what? Jesus is coming. Yeshua, Nasreta, the great miracle worker, the great teacher. They've heard about this guy, but they've not heard him. They've not experienced him. Their expectations for him are enormous, especially on this week of Passover. This is so important, and the people respond absolutely. They treat him like an arriving king. They brought a colt to Jesus, and he sat on it. That's kingship. That's how you arrive. People spread their cloaks on the road. Others spread leafy branches. They all shouted, "Hosanna, Hosanna. Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Hosanna in the highest." He is an arriving, conquering king. He is Mashiach. It fits all the bill for how it's supposed to be, how it's supposed to happen. And so the very next day, Jesus began driving out those who were selling and buying on the temple grounds, shouting to them, "It is written, my house will be called a house of prayer, but you have made it a den of robbers." Who can do business inside the temple compound? Who and only who? Levites. Only Levites can do business inside the temple grounds. Go back to Genesis or Exodus, and you'll find their commission of the 12 tribes is only they can serve Yahweh in the temple. And there's a hierarchy inside of there. But no matter how small the job, inside the temple compound, it has to be done by a Levite. So who is selling animals for sacrifice? Levites. They're making money. It's big business. All the way up to big animals, okay? And as people come in from other countries, they got to exchange their money just like any of us have to when we go to other countries. They're money changers, because if you're going to do business, you have to change the currencies into the local currency to buy the dove or the ox or whatever you're going to do for the work, the business inside. And it is only Levites who can work with you. Only Levites. And there's more. There's so much in this week. So by turning over the tables and saying what he did, he's attacking, physically attacking, the creme de la creme of the Jewish society, the Levitics, the Levites. Not just anybody, but he is absolutely going crazy on the big guys. He says this, "Beware of scribes in their long robes, enjoying attention in the markets, seats of honor in the synagogues, and places of honor at banquets, who devour widows' houses." These will receive condemnation. Who is he talking about? The power people in the city. The people who are in charge. He's not holding back at all. Not any. And more. A poor widow came and gave 2 lepta coins. That's the little tiniest coin there is. And Jesus said, "This poor widow put in more than all the others." Who's the others? For they gave from their surplus, the wealthy. But she in her poverty put in all she had. He just keeps pounding on this nail, doesn't he? In Mark, he's absolutely relentless. It's important to know this, that in this week, he has just given it to him. He's ratcheting up the heat on this. How to be popular with the poor and make enemies with the wealthy and the powerful. Well, this is a model for that. Remember the camel in the eye of the needle? He doesn't give up. He doesn't give up. The poor widow is closer to God's kingdom than the Pharisees, Sadducees, scribes, and the rich. Boy, Jesus questions the law, the centerpiece of Judaism. Who is this guy? He's a troublemaker of the highest degree. For the way the city is supposed to run and the way it has traditionally run, He is throwing a wrench into everything. And that has to anger some people, right? Jesus enters Jerusalem in the manner of a king. Jesus attacks businesses within the temple. Jesus makes fools of those in power. And just who are those in power? Well, the Jewish society, top down, were the Levites, scribes, Sadducees, and the Pharisees. And then there was a body of people called the Sanhedrin that were sort of like the Better Business Bureau or something like that, but a little worse. The Levites, tracing their tribal line back to Moses, were, according to Exodus, the only tribe who could serve Yahweh in any capacity, especially in the temple. Within the Levites existed 3 tiers. It wasn't just a Levite, you had 3 tiers, right? You had the temple priests, they're the top dogs, the temple scribes, and then the temple servants, the people who did stuff inside the temple grounds, like money changers and stuff like that. And they're all Levites, okay? They're all Levites. A man was walking to Jericho when robbers attacked. They stripped him, beat him, and left him half dead. A priest saw him. That sounds innocuous, but who can be a priest? Only the highest tier of the Levites. A priest saw him and passed by on the other side. Couldn't be bothered. Likewise, a Levite. So it's 2 Levites, but the first was a priest, but the second guy, he's just a Levite, but he's still a Levite. Okay, when he saw him, also passed by on the other side. Couldn't be bothered. Who are they? They're the super religious. The super religious couldn't be bothered. And then there's this Samaritan guy. He's nobody. Nobody. And he gets into it. And that's from Luke. But if that isn't a centerpiece, foundational concept of the Jesus message, I don't know what else is. Then there's the Sadducees, okay? The business group, the Sadducees had a rather loose approach to the 613 laws, an equally loose approach to dealing with Gentiles, the non-Jews, especially the Romans who occupied Judea. You know, there are those who didn't want anything to do with the Romans, and there were good, astute business people, right? That's the Sadducees, all right? This live and let live approach made them quite wealthy. They're happy to work with the powers that be, and it made them beneath contempt with the Pharisees, who were the absolute opposite. Okay, the Pharisees, they were the super Jews, right? They adhered to the law to the T, and they will rescue Judaism after the destruction of Jerusalem, because the temple is no more, the Levites are no more, they have no role in anything, and Judaism is now out dispersed out into the Mediterranean basin, and Pharisaic Judaism rewrites Judaism in the synagogue, saves Judaism out there. And that will have repercussions as well. They were rigid. I mean rigid. That's why they're always on Jesus' back. You never hear a Sadducee come up and say, "Why do you do this or that?" They don't care. It's the Pharisees and then the scribes who are bugged by all this. The Pharisee had an aversion to contact with anyone who was outside of the religious structure of Judaism, and that is especially the Romans, Gentiles. And the Romans are beneath contempt to them. Then there's the Sanhedrin, right? They're the big business group. The Jewish ruling body were the Sanhedrin, a council of the most influential and wealthy Jews in Jerusalem, excluding, of course, the Pharisees, right? They couldn't be seen with all of these dirty Jews. The Sanhedrin, headed by the Levitic high priest, were answerable to the Roman authority. They interfaced with the Roman authority, and the Romans could execute, the Sanhedrin could not. Do you understand that? The Sanhedrin could not execute, only the Romans could, by law. Jesus had highly offended all 3 dominant groups, right? You agree, he has done it. By entering Jerusalem, Jesus had become dangerous. The poor were calling him Mashiach and David's heir, meaning king. He arrived on a colt. So it means he's of this lineage of Jewish kings. This is bad stuff, really bad stuff. The more he aligned with the poor at the expense of the powerful and rich, the more likely it was that there would be unrest and even rioting in the city. This is a bad week for such things. Jesus had to be stopped without sparking such unrest. It was serious. Imagine being among the 12 disciples of Jesus. Peter has vowed to stop this, and Jesus admonished him soundly, saying that God's will must be done. 3 times Jesus said, I'm going to die. I'm going to die. It's not a surprise in that. Jesus is aligning with the poor and condemns the rich, the powerful, and threw at the Sanhedrin. Jesus even allowed himself to be called Mashiach. Boy, that's a title. That's a title you can't go back from. And it's Passover week, and tension is high. Jews are pouring into Jerusalem from everywhere, right? Remember, the region isn't Jewish. Jerusalem is Jewish. There's little pockets of Judaism in the region and in the Mediterranean basin, but the entire region isn't Jewish, by not even close. So Jerusalem, this is like a Hajj where you go to Mecca, okay? They come in, and the city is bursting at the seams, and there's lots of money to be made. And Jesus is throwing everything upside down. Passover was days away. The priests and the scribes were seeking how to arrest him covertly and kill him. Or get him killed, right, is better. They're saying not during the festival, otherwise there will be a riot of the people, because they're convinced that the people are on Jesus' side, and the plot is now in motion. Judas Iscariot went to the chief priests in order to betray him to them. Now, why did he do that? It's a really good question. Why? Anybody have an answer? It says that. Does it say that in all 3 of them? Yeah, it depends on which gospel. Maybe Judas saw it slipping away. Saw the promise slipping away. It's hard to say. It's hard to say, yeah. Okay, Judas went to the chief priests in order to betray him, and they were delighted when they heard this and promised to give him money. Yes? I think you can if you need to. Have a lovely evening.
Okay, I will. See you later.
Bye-bye. And he began seeking how to betray Jesus at an opportune time. Okay, the Last Supper, this upper room. This upper room. Now remember that in Jerusalem so far, he just turned over some tables. When's the Mashiach stuff supposed to happen? He hasn't performed any miracles in Jerusalem. He hasn't taught in Jerusalem. He sort of disappeared, and then he goes up in this upper room. And remember, the people thought something huge was going to happen. Don't forget this, because they're going to betray him very shortly, aren't they? The people will turn on him. Upper room. As they were reclining at table, Jesus said, "One of you will betray me. It is the one who dips bread with me in the bowl." And evidently Judas didn't hear him say that, and I don't know if anybody else noticed it. But he said so right there, and Judas does before he leaves, right? He took bread, broke it, and said, "Take, eat, this is my body." Right? This is the thing, isn't it? Then he took the cup and he gave it to them, and he said, "This is my blood of the covenant, which is being poured out for many." And they drank. What an amazing thing to be written down in Mark. Extraordinary. Eucharist is phenomenal in this. Truly unique language in many, many ways. Gethsemane. Boy, this is tough, isn't it? He goes, he says these words. He said to his disciples, I'm going to die. Son of Man is going to be killed. He says these words, my soul is grieved to the point of death. And he fell to the ground, praying that if it were possible, the hour, meaning his death, might pass from him, saying, Abba, Abba, remember that word, Abba, Father, all things are possible for you. Remove this cup from me, yet not what I will, but what you will. He does not want to die. If it is possible for you to change your mind, it would be great. But if the plan stays, then the plan stays. But boy, if it's possible, how human is that? How beautifully human is that? Judas brings soldiers of the Sanhedrin, and with a kiss, Jesus is betrayed and taken into custody. And then it all changes, doesn't it? Big time. Facing the anger of the Sanhedrin, Jesus is accused of blasphemy. That's all they can accuse him of, is blasphemy. And passed along to the Roman governor Pontius Pilate, Poncio Pilato, on charges of sedition. That's the only charge they can kill on, is sedition. It's crimes against the state, okay? He has to be labeled a rebel against Rome to be killed by Rome. That's how it works. Bar Abba in Hebrew means son. Did I skip over some things there? Were there some? There were some Barabbas things. Let's see if I can get it. Sorry, I've got some things. No, I didn't get it. Pilate is not convinced, right? He says, I don't have enough here to kill him. He's not finding sedition in there. And he says to the people, he says, I'll give you a rebel. I'll give you a rebel. You can have your rebel Barabbas, and in his place, as a rebel, I'll crucify Jesus. Make your choice. And they choose Barabbas. Bar Abba in Hebrew means son of the Father. Remember Abba, Father? Jesus prayed to Abba. Isn't it fascinating that Bar Abba would be the person, the name of the person who's a rebel? And who did the crowd choose? Jesus is just standing there. He's silent. He doesn't look very Mashiach. And there's a proven killer of Roman soldiers, that there is being offered to them to go be let free to go kill more Romans. Who looks better? Barabbas. And the deal is struck. The deal is struck. Strangely, the very people the Sanhedrin feared would riot for Jesus now choose Jesus to die. They turned on him just like that. He hadn't been good entertainment. They expected something fabulous. When, of all weeks, we're going to Jerusalem, and guess who's coming? Guess who's coming? I hear David Copperfield is coming, and he's a great magician. No, I hear Jesus of Nazareth is coming, and boy, does he have a rep for really great things. And the expectations were high, and it didn't happen. He didn't do anything in Jerusalem that they had expected, except overthrow a few tables, and who knows if that even got out. It didn't happen. Didn't happen. Condemned, Jesus is tortured and humiliated by the Roman guards before being taken away to crucify. Jesus was crucified at the third hour. The day begins at 6. The third hour is 9 in the morning. 9 in the morning. It's an important time. This is the hour of the daily temple grain sacrifices. There's 2 sacrifices given for expiation of sin in the temple every single day, 9 and noon. Is it at the third? Yep, there you go. Third and the 6th hour. Yeah. And so he is crucified at the same time as the grain sacrifices in the temple are being made. Jesus faced constant taunts and humiliation, according to Mark. Finally, at the 6th hour, noon, at the 6th hour, this was the hour of the daily temple blood sacrifices. You had to have grain and stuff like that, and then you killed the animals at the second go-round. Remember the big fire pit out front, and God loves the smell of burning fat? All that stuff that we're told, that happens all outside. Who does it? Levitic priests, or Levites. They do all this stuff. Big business. So at the 6th hour, Jesus cried out in agony, Eloi, Eloi, lema sabachthani. This is in Aramaic, the language he spoke. My God, why have you betrayed me? What a strange thing to say. How could he feel betrayed by God when he knew he was going to die, that it was the plan? He said so 3 times. He said, I really hope you can change, you can do this, but I'll go with you. It's a rough thing. But he says, lema sabachthani. Is this advancing on its own? Or is it my error? It's human error. Human error. It did it again. It's going back to the same thing. To be clear, Jesus declared on 3 occasions that the Son of Man was to be arrested, tortured, and killed. He said so. He also stated that after 3 days, the Son of Man would rise again from the dead. And this one, the disciples completely missed. At least nobody had any comment about it. I think you all agreed it was the strange one in the whole thing. Knowing all of this, why on the cross? These words. He had all of this time to be prepared for this. Now, nobody can be really properly prepared. Eloi, Eloi, lema sabachthani. Why have you betrayed me? Why have you forsaken me, let me down, walked away, didn't show up? Why didn't you do your part? What was supposed to happen in his mind? And this is in Mark. Did he feel betrayed by God? He says, why have you betrayed me? These are hard things. And they're in our Markan Gospel because whoever wrote the Markan Gospel wrote these on purpose. The Markan Gospel tells us that after only 3 days on the cross, Jesus died from crucifixion. After only 3 hours on the cross. 3 hours. He died. Put him up. 3 hours later, he's gone. Jesus' death was at the 6th hour at noon, at the time of the blood sacrifices in the temple. The Roman centurion says of Jesus, surely this must be the Son of God. Why would he say that? Don't people die on those crosses all the time? What is unusual about Jesus dying? Short time. That's a good answer. It's an excellent answer. It was way too soon. Way too soon. We're told that Joseph of Arimathea went to Pontius Pilate, the Roman governor, asking to take down the body in order to be buried in a prepared tomb. Pilate agrees. Joseph of Arimathea, Pontius, how you doing? Listen, could we cut our guy down? Would you mind if we went and cut our guy down? And it says that Pontius Pilate checked with somebody to make sure he was dead. The guy said he was, and then he gave Joseph of Arimathea permission to cut him down and put him in a prepared tomb. Sounds reasonable, but it's not. Pontius Pilate, the Roman governor, was removed. Oh, Jesus did it again. I can't keep up with this. Pontius Pilate was removed from his position because he was so vicious towards the Jews who he hated. That's why he was removed from the governorship. He was so extreme that he was recalled back to Rome. He didn't like the Jews. Joseph of Arimathea, hey, would you do me a favor? Sure, no problem. But it's not that simple either. It's not that simple. We have to make some observations about the science of crucifixion. This was no small thing. It was a science. It was for a specific reason, had specific methods, and it was used over and over again. The goal of crucifixion was to terrorize the population, not the victims, through prolonged and torturous process before the victims succumbed to death. In other words, to keep it going as long as possible, to keep them alive on the cross as long as possible. 2 to 3 days was the goal. 2 to 3 days. Okay? The eventual death of the crucified victim was due to suffocation. Couldn't keep his legs up, so his legs would go down and he'd be like this, and he'd die of suffocation. He could no longer support himself with his feet. And getting back up here, you die of suffocation. I'm dry in the mouth tonight. In this position. And so it was keeping this balance between this. All right? To hold themselves, the upper body could no longer take in air due to restrained arms and shoulders. But this is to be intentionally kept going as long as possible. As desperate family and friends, horrified, watched this unfold over days. The crosses were guarded by Roman soldiers precisely to keep the victim securely on the cross and unburied. They didn't bury these guys. The indignity of a Jew being hung on a cross and never buried breaks all kinds of codes. And this is a big problem because there is a science of this. Let's see if this is going to do anything. Nails were unnecessary. You don't waste steel on things like that because ropes are both effective and reusable. This is the science of Roman crucifixion. It is a little bit of a stretch to assume that the 4 gospel writers were particularly knowledgeable about a torture and killing method that they probably never even saw before. Because the Romans didn't do this a lot. They did it around Jerusalem because they couldn't get this population to straighten up. But it was not a widespread empire thing. Okay, cross uprights need not be much higher than the ground. They didn't have to be. They tied their legs to the thing just so they could push themselves back up again and gasp in some air over time. And they gave them water freely because that helps to keep the process as prolonged as possible. The idea was not to kill the victim. It was to terrify the population with the method of death in this fashion. So you have your cross, you got your victim, you got your ropes, and they're right there. And then you have this where they're fatiguing and they start to sag. But this wasn't the worst of it. So beatings and blood loss defeated the purpose of the intended prolongation of the process. The whole goal is to keep them up there as long as possible. Again, it was to terrify a difficult population, but the worst part was that the body was left on the cross. So the family had to see this process. The body was left on the cross without burial. The carrion, until carrion had reduced it to mere bones that then fell to the ground. And all the meanwhile, Roman soldiers are guarding this to keep the families away, to not cut them down. Because the indignity of this process of leaving them on the crosses well after they've died, This was the worst part of it. And they didn't have crucifixion parties way over here on the side. They were by the city gates, so everybody had to pass by them. This is where you did it, to keep this population terrified. Crucifixion was not used often in the Roman Empire. It simply wasn't. Returning to the Markan Gospel. At sunrise, the morning after Sabbath. Now that's kind of strange. If it's Sunday, it can't be the morning after Sabbath, but then Sabbath finished at 6 o'clock the night before on Saturday, so that's about right, in a way, if we think of it differently than ours. At sunrise, the morning after Sabbath, 3 women, this is in the Markan Gospel, Mary Magdalene, Mary, James's mother, and Salome came to the tomb to anoint the body. We've all heard this, right? It's early in the morning, sunrise. Inside the tomb, a young man in white told them that Jesus was not there. That's a shocker. He orders them to tell the disciples to meet Jesus in Galilee, right? Leaving in fear, the women tell no one of this. Mark 15:8. And that's the end of Mark. That's the end of Mark. Look in your Bibles and you'll see little notations that it'll say that Mark 15:9 is not written by Mark. Okay? Leaving in fear, the women tell no one of this. What about the Great Commission? That's a great bit of writing. It's not written in Mark. It's not in Mark. What about snakes? Those poor snake handlers, not written by Mark. What about poison? It's not written by Mark. The Markan Gospel ends as follows. Go tell his disciples he's going to Galilee, and there you will see him, just as he told you. They fled from the tomb. The 3 women, they fled from the tomb, for trembling had gripped them, and they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. That's what it says in the Markan Gospel. They said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. Now, 15:9, non-Markan, but it's in all your Bibles, says, now after he'd risen early on the first day of the week. Boy, that's smooth. What preceded it, and now it says, and now after he'd risen early on the first day, I mean, this is so clumsy, the writing. He first appeared to Mary Magdalene. Now we don't have the other 2 women. She went and reported to those who had been with him, meaning the disciples, while they were mourning and weeping. Well, that's a solution to the Markan ending, what is really in Mark. And that's the short one. And no effort is spent on a smooth transition. It's so clunky. Wonder how many people notice that. And Mark 16:9 and later versions add 9 through 20. There's a whole lot of writing. And at the end, it's in my name, they will cast out demons, they will speak with new tongues, they will pick up serpents, and if they drink deadly poison, it won't harm them. Whatever happened to not testing God in those ones? You know, this is the end. This is the added editorial ending. And when the Lord Jesus had spoken to them, he was received up into heaven and sat down at the right hand of God. And they went out and preached everywhere while the Lord worked with them. That's the end of the long version of the added section to Mark. Did you know that? Did you know that?
I did not, but it's something I'm going to read.
Look at your little things at the bottom of the page. It's in every one of them that these are all additions. This is not in Mark. It's added by later editors. I'm wondering who saw Jesus set next to God. What a thing to write. That Jesus sat down next to God. Who would write that when they're just adding stuff to someone else's work? That takes a lot of chutzpah, I think. Our earliest Markan versions end with Mark 15:8, right? They said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. Look at how much is in all of your Bibles. Look at it scrolling down. Look at that. Look at that. It's not written by the Markan author. To be clear, the Markan author didn't write these. They were added by later editors. Editors. People who were working with this material. That's why it's easy to question the content. I know a pastor that would say, well, since it's in, it's still the Word of God. Oh, whose phone is phoning? The time is, it said 8 o'clock p.m. As you can see from the previous slides, the Markan Gospel begins with the baptism of Jesus by John. There is no birth narratives. Something's vastly missing. If you started in your Bible with Matthew as the first gospel, and then you went to Mark, you wouldn't know the difference, would you? But when you start with Mark and then you move on to Matthew, and you have huge amounts that are different, that's hard. It's more noticeable if it's in the order of Mark, Matthew, Luke, and John. No birth narrative. He's a grown man. No virgins, no semi-divinity. There is a dove, but if he's not half divine, if he's not semi-divine through a virgin birth, we have a different story. You are the kindest man I've ever known. Thank you.
Yes, he is, I would agree.
I was getting really dry. Thank you, sir. Thank you. So, this is Mark. This is Mark. There's no Joseph. Isn't there supposed to be a Joseph? Joseph won't be invented yet. Not for another 15, 16 years. No Sermon on the Mount, no raising of Lazarus, no appearance at the tomb, no road to Emmaus, no appearance in the upper room, and no ascension. Jesus does not ascend in Mark. You wonder what happened to him, right? Makes you wonder if Jesus, waiting in Galilee, said to himself, gee, I wonder what happened. Why aren't they here? But the women didn't tell anybody. So how would they know to come to Galilee? And finally, did he just decide to ascend to heaven? It doesn't say. In Mark, he never leaves. He just, we have no contact with him after this crucifixion in Mark. At all, none. And finally decided, did he decide then? And the problem is we just don't know. We just don't know. We're left with the Markan Gospel. It ends in a mystery. And our later Gospels will change this so the mystery goes away. But you cannot get around the Markan Gospel. It absolutely stands on its own two legs, and it is the first written gospel that we have to work with. And in that, it has an authenticity that is quite unique. And next week, we'll take a look at exactly why that authenticity matters a lot. Okay, it's 5 after. I've tried to get this thing in, and I'm sorry that I was, yes, ma'am?
Yeah, I'm saying you said there's no commission, but by the silence, the commission is to us.
That is an interpretation. That is a...
The silence says, we do it, you go on and do it.
That's where interpretation is important. Maybe the mystery is better because it asks more of us. Yes, sir.
I would keep in mind also that the writing or the readers of who this was written for was not to know the history from birth to the death, the resurrection. The purpose was for who was being written for. It wasn't to be like it's going to be part of 4 Gospels.
Right.
You know, the purpose was for a specific reason.
Well, let us agree that this was the tradition of a given community. It wasn't all of early Christianity. It was one little pocket of Christians, and they had gotten Jesus sayings. Well, that's what went around first. Jesus sayings and stories, and then the stories grow over 42 years. You bet the stories grew, and the whole concept of Jesus and what it meant to them, and then somebody in this particular community wrote it down. Now that's huge. You go from oral to written, and suddenly we have the Markan Gospel. It is one community, and it's a single author, it's not multiple. It is some author was moderately skilled at Greek, literate, and wrote it down. It's the shortest gospel. It's only 15 chapters. Yes, ma'am.
I got a couple of things along that line. The fact that it was written very shortly after the temple was destroyed. Judaism as they knew it was history.
You bet.
And they were probably thinking, we had this little pocket writing, we better get something down in writing right now because everybody's just the diaspora.
Yeah.
Happening. So we better get something in writing right now. The other thing that an observation when Jesus was cleansing the temple, and it was all just the Levites
Yeah.
that could only do that. What probably additionally ticked them off, but he was not a Levite. He was from the tribe of Judah. So we've got this somebody, hey, he's not even one of us
Mm-hmm.
telling us what to do. So that really could have added to them being angry.
I would think.
But then another thing, with the idea of the anointed one is one who leads them out. That whole concept, at that time, they were looking for deliverance from the Romans.
Yeah.
What was the concept when it first started, like way back Solomon and David? What was the idea of who this anointed one would be and what would be his purpose?
When were Jews ever not a vassal state to somebody bigger? Never.
David and Solomon. Weren't they king of the hill at that time? For a few years.
It says they were. It says they were. But in terms of historically, 1947. But they were. It doesn't tell us it in the Old Testament, but there were Egyptian garrisons all up and down the coastline because they were run by Egypt, and then Assyria, and then Egypt again, and then Babylon, and then the Persians, and then the Greeks, and then there was problems with Greeks fighting Greeks, and you had a little Maccabean thing in there, and then bingo, you got Rome. They were always under the thumb of someone, and that's the point. Rome, big deal. That's all they knew. Rome was just the latest. And so a Mashiach, the idea of a Mashiach coming and freeing them from whoever is the latest power over them. And right now. Exactly. And this has been the idea for Mashiach. How many of you drive by signs on the way into the airport that'll say, Rabbi so-and-so is the Messiah? And then he dies. And he wasn't the Messiah. So it's still ongoing. The idea that there's going to be a rabbi who is going to liberate Judaism from the bondage of the world is still this hope. Next year in Jerusalem, right, Bruce? Next year in Jerusalem. That's the whole point. And so this was what a Mashiach would do. And so it was as old as their experience with, because they were always, always, always run by somebody else. Always. Yeah. Yes.
And while they're always occupied, they have this unique sense that they should be sovereign over this land and allowed to live in peace and run it themselves.
And beyond, and beyond.
Particular lack of success at what they believe they should have.
Absolutely. You know, for God's chosen, they didn't rule over anything in their history. For being God's chosen, it sure didn't manifest itself in any way in their history. And this is a problem. And this is what made the powers that be very angry at them, because they were so snooty to everybody else, and they got into trouble. No wonder they did crucifixions there, because they couldn't get these tough-necked people, right? Right back to Exodus. They still were, yes. Go.
The Lord said in Deuteronomy 28, if you will obey me, I will bless your land. I'll bless your fields and all that. But if you disobey me, then he'll curse your land. So they just weren't obeying what the Lord told them in the first place. That's why they continue to have problems.
So they were always doomed. They never stood a chance, did they? So were they set up that they never stood a chance? If so, no Jew was ever good enough for God.
No, I'm not saying that.
No, I'm saying that. I'm saying. No, I'm not saying that's true. I'm saying that out loud, because they never stood a chance. Nobody could pull it off. And so, yeah, it's complicated, isn't it? It really is, and it is never solved by easy statements, because it's vastly more complex than an easy or a glib statement. And according to Paul, yeah, sola fide, according to Paul. And yet, Paul never met him, or walked with him, or heard him, or worked with him. So, and James, the letter of James said, faith without works is no faith at all. This was the fight of the first century, because Paul was saying sola fide. It's grace alone. And yet, within the early church, they were having at it over Paul's opinions. They didn't agree with him. And he condemned them utterly and said, anybody who doesn't agree with me is against God, and they are condemned. So, big personalities. That's an amazing first century of Christianity. Extraordinary. It's where most of this was written down. It's fascinating. It really is. And we have the Markan gospel. Isn't that extraordinary that we have this odd gospel in many ways? It is unique. It's all a mystery. Thank you all so much. We have gone 15 over, but we've had a grand time. And I'll get a new dongle so I can be better at it than this.